Welcome to Big Blend Radio with your hosts, Lisa and Nancy, editors of BigBlendMagazine.com.
Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Author Show with Books Forward. Nancy and I are excited today to chat with J. Lawrence Matthews about his novel, One Must Tell the Bees, The Final Education of Sherlock Holmes, and it's out now through East Dean Press. You can get it on places like Amazon. Ask your independent bookstore for his book. I always say that. And go right to his website, jlawrencematthews.com. So welcome. How are you?
Good. I'm great. How are you?
Oh, we're doing good. Where are you today? Are you on your book tour?
Sort of. I'm in Nashville. My wife and I are driving north from Florida to Rhode Island for the summer, and we are stopping in to see my editor, who is based in Nashville. I've never met her in the flesh. She's an A+ editor. She was fabulous. And the fellow who hooked us up had written his memoirs. He's a songwriter from Nashville. He's an old friend of mine. And so we're all going to have dinner tonight.
Oh, nice. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Cool.
Yeah, because you're based in Florida, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So how did Sherlock Holmes get into the Civil War and connect with Abraham Lincoln? Let's get right into this. I was this is totally different. When we read about your book coming out, we're like, we need to get this.
Well, I hope a lot of people feel that way. It was two book ideas, book titles that popped into my head over a period of a couple of years. This goes back to 2009 or 10. I had finished writing a nonfiction book for McGraw-Hill called, I'm blanking. It was on Warren Buffett, and it was Pilgrimage to Omaha. That's what it was. And it was about my visits to the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meetings. I don't know if you've heard of them. Warren Buffett hosts them every year. They're a big deal in financial circles. 30,000 people go. Buffett calls it Woodstock for capitalists.
That's funny.
And I was in the financial world, and I wrote, I had a blog at that point, a financial blog, and I wrote a long series about going to this meeting that McGraw-Hill picked up on and said, would you turn it into a book? And I'd always wanted to write a book, and I said, yeah, sure. And so I wrote a kind of a Hunter S. Thompson travelogue about going to this meeting without the drugs and the guns.
I was going to say, well, there's opioids in this book.
Wait a minute.
No. Not that part of Hunter S. Thompson. But just to make it fun, and why do people go? What do they get out of it? So when I finished that, I thought, okay, I know how to write a book. I had started books over the years, mysteries, thrillers that always had very boring central characters that sounded a lot like myself. And I would lose interest and get bored. I could never find a voice, and I'd always thought it'd be fun to write a Sherlock Holmes book that was as good as one of the originals, as that had that voice and was compelling, and not just sort of fan fiction, but really had the voice. And one day I was in the shower and my mind was wandering, as it tends to do when I'm in the shower, and Death of Sherlock Holmes popped into my head. And I thought, that would be a cool story. That would be fun to write. And so I started working on it, and I set it in 1918, which was the end of World War I. The last we'd heard of Holmes was at the beginning of World War I. That was his last case. I set it in the South Downs of England, where he retired to tend his bees and to write his manuscript on rational deduction. And I knew that his death would involve the bees and that manuscript. And I just had to figure out how to get Watson down from London to, they could have their final adventure and Watson could write about the death of Sherlock Holmes for everybody. And I worked on that for a couple of years, but I wasn't getting very far because I had a very full-time job. And then one day, again, I was in the shower. Again, my mind was wandering. And Sherlock Holmes meets Abraham Lincoln popped into my head.
That's a trip.
And I thought, that would be cool.
Why not?
I'm the reason it happened, in the back of my brain is I am a Civil War guy. I have studied it for a long time, and our daughters will tell you about all the battlefields we visited on vacations that, and I can really geek out when I'm talking to those park rangers about what. And so I started working on that, and I thought I had two books. I thought I had Death of Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes Meets Abraham Lincoln, and the question was, which one do I finish first? But as I started working on them, I realized they were actually one book with two intertwined stories. And so One Must Tell the Bees actually opens in 1918, in October 1918. Watson is in a train headed for the South Downs to rescue his friend, Sherlock Holmes. In his valise, he's got two documents. One is the manuscript on rational deduction. Holmes has finally written it, and he sent it to Watson to have Watson read it. And he also sent a note. There's also a note attached to it from Holmes saying, Watson, I've relapsed. I'm hopelessly addicted to a malignant class of opiates. Please bring your medical kit and come. Watson's heading to his friend's aid. And while he's in the train, he pulls out that manuscript and starts reading. And he discovers that it is the untold story of Holmes's early years when he went to America in the last year of the Civil War as a researcher, a chemical researcher into smokeless gunpowder for the DuPont company. And DuPont made half the gunpowder for the Union Army back then. And that begins the Holmes meets Abraham Lincoln adventure, in which he ultimately ends up taking part in the hunt for John Wilkes Booth.
That's crazy.
And so we're there until Watson reads the story. At the end of that story, he gets to the South Downs, he gets to Holmes's cottage, and now we're back in 1918, and we're back in the Death of Sherlock Holmes story, and that's how the book came about.
That's wild. I mean, this is, we have our happy hour show, and we always ask, if you could spend happy hour with anyone, who would it be? Alive or dead, who would it be, and where would you spend it, and what would you have for happy hour? What would you drink? And I feel like your book was like comes out of our happy hour show. You'd have, but then, John Wilkes Booth. I mean, that's interesting too, because he, that's like a manhunt. It's like, this is the O.J. Simpson of way back when.
Well, I knew that having Holmes in America, I knew that it would tell the story of what we now know was his first real case.
Yeah.
And when this is a great point you raised, because when I set out to write it, I was thinking it would involve a fictional case. I originally thought it was going to be the hunt for the Confederate gold, because there was an idea when Jefferson Davis fled the Richmond Confederate White House. He took with him the train, the Confederate treasury on the rail car with him. And there's always been these questions, this rumor: what happened to all that money? There were bills, there were notes, there was gold. What happened to it? And there have been a couple of fictional books, the hunt for Confederate gold. And I thought I'll have Sherlock solve that mystery. But as I was writing the book, and that was my original idea, but as I was writing the book, I learned something that really blew my mind. A, it blew my mind, and B, it altered the course of the book. I had decided that anybody that asked what I was doing, I would tell them, I'm writing a book. What are you writing? Because some writers don't like to talk about what they're doing. And I would tell them, I'm writing a book. And if they asked what it was, I would say Sherlock Holmes meets Abraham Lincoln. And because I wanted the pressure, I didn't want to be able to slink away after a couple of years and say, I wasn't really working on anything. I wanted the pressure of people asking me, how's the book going? And I learned, having done that most people, Holmes's character was so precisely crafted by Arthur Conan Doyle that most people think he was a real guy.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Especially young people, but even the generation that grew up reading those stories, there's something about him that because people would say, when I would say Sherlock Holmes meets Abraham Lincoln, they would say, now, did he actually, was he in America at that point? Because I thought he was only in England. You know, they would talk about like, and I thought, oh, wow, okay. I'm going to put Sherlock Holmes in the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth, and I'm going to tell it as history. And the voice of the book became, this happened. It was no longer, I'm going to tell you a fun story. It was, this happened. And so that changed the entire character of the book, because it became something that's told as history. And then everything that happens in the book had to match the history of those times and those people.
Wow.
And that was my goal.
Wow.
My goal was to make people think, you know, did this really happen? And the funniest part was when I was having my picture taken for the cover, and this, I love this, the assistant came up to me, this young woman, probably 22 years old, and she said to me, you know, I didn't know Sherlock Holmes was part of the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. And I thought, that's great. I love it.
That's funny.
You know,
I like it.
I think it's so important because history is so hard to get people
Mhm.
involved. You know, Nancy and I travel full time documenting parks, public lands, including battlefields. And, you know, I know Brandywine Creek area is definitely part of this story. And we were there, and, you know, it was so interesting going from the Southwest and the Pacific West, where we've, you know, been majority of our time in this country, out east to, you know, this, suddenly we're staying in a bed and breakfast, the Wild Wisteria. We were talking about this before we were recording, but Wild Wisteria Inn, and they're like, well, this was built in the 1700s. This battle came right up to this door, and now there's a highway, but that farmhouse across there was actually part of this property. And we're like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
But it's so hard. And, you know, through storytelling, books and movies, and actually going to places like a battlefield as a kid, that's what got me involved and interested in history, was actually going to the places. Luckily in South Africa, that was one, like Ishlawanda Rock with Shaka Zulu. And then I was
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, people really died here. Going through the battlefields just for the Civil War, when you realized these battles happened on farms, and women and children,
Yeah.
then normally they're working the farm, and the, you know, now suddenly they're fighting it out, and it's like they would march up to each other with cannons and everything and just kill each other off. And the next morning you wake up on your farm, not that you went to sleep, and your farm is like a blood zone, you know, it's a death zone.
Right.
When you go
Oh.
out there, that's huge. I know you're a Civil War buff. Did you go to a lot of battlefields and places to get the history?
Well, I'd been doing that for years, and I didn't have to do a lot of extra research on the Civil War. I've visited, you know, I'm in Nashville today. I've been here before on business, and when I was here, I went to Franklin, I went to Stones River. I've been to Memphis, and when I was out there, I went to Shiloh.
Wow.
I think the only place I really haven't been to is Vicksburg. And they're so profound. And I don't know if have you ever been to Appomattox?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
No.
I've been there a few times, but the most meaningful time was I went there. I got there too late. It was like 5:30, and the entrance was closed. So I parked up the road. There's a cemetery up the road where you can park and pay your respects at the cemetery. And I hopped the fence, and I walked the path that Grant took when he was riding to meet Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. And it was dusk, and you know they were all there. It was really something.
Do you want your book to be made into a movie? Because I think it would be awesome.
Yeah, I think so.
I can, I see, that's what I see it as. Those are the images in my head. And there's a lot of different ones. And it's not just the American story, but also the Sherlock Holmes story in 1918 and his final education. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Wouldn't
even
it be fun to play Sherlock Holmes, to be the actor? That
Well,
would be great.
You'd have to be really, really good because
Yeah.
he's such a vivid character,
Mhm.
and everyone thinks they know him.
Yeah.
yeah, that's a
In fact, I've been auditioning people for the audiobook.
oh cool.
Wow.
And I'm pretty particular about that because I do listen to a lot of audiobooks. In fact, in the 2 or 3 years where I was seriously working on this full time, I had been working on it for about 10 years off, in my spare time. But I listened to nothing but Sherlock Holmes books because I had to keep that voice in my head because that's not my natural writing voice.
Mhm.
And so, and it's so precise, and it's different from Watson, and it's different from his brother Mycroft. And then in my book, I've got an American story with Abraham Lincoln and Edwin Stanton and Henry DuPont of the DuPont Company. And so it's very tricky. And we auditioned probably half a dozen actors, and they were very good, but it really takes something special to have a voice that can get Holmes versus a British accent that's Sherlock Holmes, his brother Mycroft, who's gruffer and a little more portly and a little more British, and then Watson, who's kind of older and a little not as bright. All those things, all those flavors, very hard to get. Very interesting.
Watson's like Higgins to me.
Yeah.
Higgins.
It could be Higgins.
Does he have Doberman pinchers?
Yeah.
Well,
Think about doing an American detective like Columbo and trying to find someone to do that voice.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Columbo. I don't think we have any famous American detectives. Really, do we? Other than maybe Columbo?
Well, we may soon because once I got the manuscript to my editor a year ago, I started reading. I was able to read anything I wanted to. I didn't have to just read Sherlock Holmes. and at first I had this very strange craving. I had this craving to read old classics that I'd never read before. I had a Graham Greene book on my bookshelf from my college days, this little paperback that was one of those things where I was always going to get to it and never did, and felt guilty and never wanted to get rid of it. And so it stayed on my bookshelf, every house we had, every apartment. And when I finished my book, I thought, okay, now I can read that. And I picked it up and I read it. And it was really interesting because I found that having written a fiction book end to end, I actually kind of understood what he was doing in that book much better than if I had read it when I was supposed to in college. And so I kept going. I read a lot of anything that I had not gotten to that I felt I should. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, a lot of Chekhov, a lot of Poe, C.S. Forster, E.M. Forster, C.S. Lewis, Somerset Maugham of Human Bondage. That was a slog. And that was actually put the kibosh on it because it was, there's a lot of word for word's sake in some of that stuff. But more recently, I read a book called A Negro and an Au Fait by a guy named Danny Gardner, who was a stand-up comic in Chicago, and I heard him on a podcast, the Reading and Writing podcast, and he's an African-American detective back in the 50s called Elliot Caprice, and Danny Gardner created this guy, and it was fabulous, and he's written a follow-up which I'm going to read next, but. That could be one detective to watch, Nancy.
There you go.
Cool.
I find it interesting what you're talking about, having the voice of Sherlock Holmes. because, when you think about writing, when you read as a reader, you do start to paint the characters. And I love the front cover of your book because it it has that British vibe, it just has that old school, British, yeah, we're going in. And there's something really amazing about British TV, British movies, British reading, because they're so character driven. But you doing the voice, I think that's an interesting way of writing, because as a reader, we're very visual, and you do start to create those voices. And when it's a good book, you start to have that co-creative experience. So when you're writing, I mean, do you go British? Because I know we proofread our magazine sometimes. It's like, oh dear, everything is in British, because then you'll slow down and you have to read your words, and you slow down with it. So
Well,
do you have
it's
different
funny.
accents? Yeah.
Yeah, and the when I hear the characters talking, it's that accent, it's that British accent, and I it's funny because I had a stretch of time. This goes back about 2 years, when I was working through my third or fourth draft, and I got lazy. My inner English student took over. And because it's a long book, it's 179,000 words. I kept thinking, I got to cut it down. And I kind of lost the voice for about 3 months. I started looking visually at the pages and thinking, I can cut this, I can cut that, I can tighten these paragraphs. And I fortunately, every day I save everything, every file. And anytime I make a change or cut something, I save that.
Oh, I need to learn that.
Yeah, very important. And
it is.
And I got about 3 months into this draft, and I all of a sudden I thought, I wrote this a lot better 6 months ago. Why? And I went back. I started going back to these paragraphs and thinking, this is no good. And I would go back 6 months, find the paragraph, cut it and paste it back in. And then I was cutting and pasting whole pages back in. And it was really, I don't know what happened, but I lost that voice for about 3 months. And so I always pay attention to that voice. And anytime I hear that voice talking, and I'm working on my next book, which also involves Holmes.
Cool.
And the scenes, when the scenes come at you, it's always that voice talking. And anytime I got in trouble, anytime I had a problem, like something I was working through, I had this one scene in the book where it was a technical problem. And what happens is, it's when Watson finally arrives at Holmes's cottage, and he's gone through this great adventure that day, for reasons I don't want to spoil the plot with, but he's been reading Holmes's remarkable story about America. There's been an incident in the train that totally threw him for a loop. And when he arrived at Holmes's cottage, he was confronted by a woman who claimed Holmes no longer lived there. And so he's just had this flustered day, but he's finally entering the cottage. Holmes has greeted him. They're reunited, and he enters the cottage. And I thought he should faint. I thought Watson would faint because of the smell. Smell is such a powerful thing. When you go into an elementary school, that smell takes you back to when you were in 5th grade, right? So I thought, the first thing Watson's going to do is he's going to faint. But then I thought, well, I've got to describe this cottage, the interior, because that's where a lot of the second half of the book takes place. So the reader has to get a sense of this. So do I have him blurt out a description of what he sees first and then faint, or does he faint and then when he wakes up he describes everything? It's this really goofy technical thing, and I couldn't get it right, and I kept going back and forth, and I literally would cut and paste. Watson faints, then he describes. Watson describes, then he faints. And I would, and every time I'd read it, I'd think, no, this isn't right. And one day, it was a Friday, and I decided, okay, tomorrow is Saturday. I have all day tomorrow. I'm going to fix this tomorrow. And I got into the shower. It was late in the day, and I had to clear my head. I stepped into the shower, and as I did, the scene started playing in my head, and Watson and Holmes started talking, and in 15 seconds I had it.
So this is it. The key to writing is get in the shower.
Yeah.
That's
it.
At least for me, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's got their thing, it's interesting. And I mean, this whole thing, I mean, did you ever think you were going to write a novel going from, writing about financial, stuff? I don't want to say the word stuff, but financial, writing financial
stuff, yeah.
Stuff to suddenly writing a novel that's got all this history in it and, full character. Yeah.
No, but I always wanted to write, and I've wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. I just never had the confidence to make that my full-time job. I went to college, and so back in elementary school, grade school, high school, how there was always a kid in your writing class who would write an essay that the teacher would get so excited about, she would read it to the class, and you'd go, well, that was never me, right? Never. I never had that. But I was always kind of competitive about it. I'd always think, well, how did they do this? What do they see that I'm not seeing? So I kind of always wanted to write, but I never had the self-confidence. I go to college, I went to Lehigh, studied finance, because I do like the stock market. That does fascinate me, and it helped me raise my family. But I had a great writing teacher, writing professor. I had a great journalism professor there. And when I got out and I started working on Wall Street at Merrill Lynch in New York, by day I would work on Wall Street, and by night I would go back to my studio apartment and write short fiction, short humor. I wanted to be James Thurber.
Okay.
That was my, and I would write these 2, 3, 4-page pieces. I'd send it to the New Yorker with a self-addressed stamped envelope. This was before email. Yeah. And they would send it back, and I would rewrite it, send it to the Atlantic Monthly. They would send it back. I'd rewrite, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I always had about 2 or 3 or 4 pieces out there. And after 2 years, I had 3 pieces accepted.
Oh, cool.
1 to the Boston Globe, 1 to the New York Times, and 1 piece was read on NPR with Susan Stamberg. Cool. And yeah, very cool. And I got paid all of $150. The New York Times was the only place that paid for it. And so I figured, okay, I better focus on this finance thing, because this writing thing is not going to.
It's not working.
but I always did write, and I always had a book going, as I said before. But as I also said, I just never had a voice that was that compelling.
Wow.
So, and out of my interest in Holmes and out of my interest in the Civil War came these 2 ideas together.
I love going on your website too, because you give the history. For those of us who travel, now it's going to be different when we go back to Pennsylvania and Maryland. We're going to be like, okay, because with Books Forward, Books Forward, they actually have a map. We're doing literary landmarks across the country. And we just stumble on them. And sometimes we don't know about the author until we stumble there, or we do know. And we've done everything. What Steinbeck, we've got Helen Hunt Jackson. We've done so much. I mean, it's amazing where you go to these places like Thomas Wolfe in Asheville, North Carolina. But now and O. Henry, they were both in the same graveyard. And people are putting pennies on Thomas Wolfe and O. Henry. You're not supposed to. It's only one of them that you're supposed to do the pennies. But it's interesting. So when we get to go back to Pennsylvania, we're going to have to tie that in because we
Sure.
were right there. We're going to have to
Mhm.
tie your book into a literary landmark because it's exciting.
Well,
that you-
speaking of that, excuse me, I'll tell you a story. I there's no record of actually where Holmes retired to in the actual stories. There
Hmm.
are some clues. He was 5 miles from Eastbourne. He was near the English Channel, and I had fixed on a town called East Dean, and which fit those parameters. And it's a lovely town, and my wife and I visited it a couple times.
Oh,
I
cool.
communicated with their historian to get as much information as I could about East Dean as I was writing. And we'd actually been there once before. Last year we went just before COVID shut things down because I wanted to see it in winter. I told my wife, I said, you may not want to go to England in January, but I really feel like I've got to go and see what it's like in winter because that's where the story takes place, a good part of. And she said, of course, and we went. And the second time we were there, I'm in the village green of East Dean. It's a very tiny little community. And there's a building. I noticed this building in the village green that's got a kind of a decal on it, a landmark. And it was put there by people who decided, some group who decided that this was the town where Sherlock Holmes had retired to. And it
Oh,
was
wow.
a plaque dedicating this house. This was the site of where Sherlock Holmes retired, and I hadn't known.
Wow.
Anybody else had already figured this out. So, yeah, there's a lot of great places like that you can get to.
That's
That's
cool.
fun.
Yeah, well, we do an English story connection with our Glenn Burrows. He's a tour guide in Norfolk, England, but he takes people around, authors like you and family, people digging up their family history because there's so many connections. So now we'll have to go to England. Thank you.
Yes.
We're always telling Glenn, we're threatening him that we'll come over because we're a little loud. We lived in England for about a year and a half, and apparently we're too loud for the island. I don't know. It just
Oh,
happens.
well.
But yeah, so now I heard that you've got more writing. So you're going to do some more traveling, right?
Yes, and this will be a bit far further afield. There's a 3-year period when Holmes was thought to be dead. He had that battle. He had that battle with Professor Moriarty over the Reichenbach Falls, and disappeared. And 3 years later, he walks into Watson's surgery and causes Watson to faint. And they're reunited. And he tells Watson that he's been. And this is from the story called The Empty House. It's the, Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes
Right.
in The Final Problem or something, I think it was. And there was so much clamor to bring him back to life that he did sometime later. And when Holmes returns and talks to Watson about what he's been doing, he says he spent 2 years touring Tibet, exploring Tibet in the guise of a Norwegian explorer. He paid a visit to the head Lama, the Dalai Lama. Then he went to Mecca. Then he went to Khartoum. And then he returned to the continent by way of France. And I've always thought that's a really fascinating itinerary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very spiritual. Who wouldn't want to know what Sherlock Holmes and the Dalai Lama talked about, right?
Yeah.
So
Sure.
that's my idea. And it's the story of what happened during those 3 years. And it's called On the Edge of Revelation, Sherlock Holmes, the Dalai Lama, and the Great Game. And the Great Game was a diplomatic chess match that was going on in that period of time between England and Russia over Tibet.
Wow.
Russia, the Tsar wanted to extend Russian influence south towards India. England was panic-stricken that they were going to head into India. And so England was sort of moving this way, and they met in Tibet. They were both trying to kind of open up Tibet. And that's the background of why he's there, I think. So that's what's going to happen in the next book.
That's cool.
Wow.
I want to read that. They need to
Cool.
go to the Rock of Gibraltar so you can go play with the monkeys.
What a great idea.
Yeah.
You got to play Bob Dylan music when you go there.
Yeah.
Just because we're recording this on Bob Dylan's birthday, you know. And it was Sir Arthur Coyle. It was his birthday 2 days ago. Yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
hello, this is good. So that's it. You're chasing Sherlock Holmes around the world, basically, is
Yes.
what's going on, and time
Cool.
traveling. I
Yes.
love this. I love this.
Mm.
So everyone, the best thing is to go to your website for your book, right? And you
Yes.
need to go anyway, just because you got to connect. It's jlawrencematthews.com for everyone to keep up with you. And it has been a real pleasure meeting you and talking about your amazing book. And everyone, again, let me give everyone the title of the book. It is One Must Tell the Bees, The Final Education of Sherlock Holmes, and we're excited that there's more. So you got to keep us posted.
That's very
Thank
cool.
you. I will. It's Abraham Lincoln and the final education
Oh.
of Sherlock Holmes. We added that at the last minute because some
Oh.
people said, "Why isn't Lincoln's name in the
Yeah.
cover?" Because he's so
Mm.
important to the story.
He is. And that's funny too. So did you do a lot of research on him, or do you know that from Civil War?
I read a lot about the Lincoln White House,
Okay.
and I read a lot about because Holmes spends time there.
Mm.
And he accompanies Lincoln on that trip Lincoln made to Richmond in the final days of the Civil War. I also read quite a bit of the slave narratives. Some very smart person in the Federal Writers Project in the 30s decided we have to interview former slaves before they die and learn their stories. And they interviewed thousands of former slaves. And I had a character. I don't know if we have time for this.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I had a character literally walk out of the shadows in the book as I was writing it and enter the book. When Sherlock Holmes was going to America, I knew he would need a companion on his journey. I knew he would need somebody to do these, to have these adventures with, someone who knew him, who could get him around. He couldn't just come to America and start solving things and end up in the manhunt for Booth. But I always thought it was going to be Eddie Stanton, who was the son of Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's war secretary. Edwin Stanton, the war secretary, was responsible for Holmes coming to America for reasons that readers will discover. And I thought, well, since Sherlock is staying at the Stanton house when he's in Washington and getting to know Eddie Stanton, the son, they'll become pals, and that will be his companion. And I was writing a scene at the Navy Yard Bridge where Eddie is stationed. He's a guard. He's stationed at the Navy Yard Bridge, and Sherlock is going there to visit him, and they are going to bond that night because they were kind of different guys, and it wasn't natural that they would become friends. So I had a scene where they were going to bond, and as I'm writing the scene, Sherlock is walking through this section of Washington that was where a lot of freed slaves settled once Virginia started to get open up, once Grant's army started to free slaves as he moved towards Richmond. And I'm writing this, and Holmes is walking through the section, and all of a sudden this young freed slave boy appears and asks Holmes if he's lost. And Holmes says, I'm looking for the Navy Yard Bridge. And they go off together. And I'm writing this thinking, and my right brain is going, no, this isn't the guy. You don't know this guy. This character doesn't exist. Sherlock's going to be friends with Eddie Stanton. And my left brain is going, no, this is really good. Eddie Stanton.
This is cool.
Eddie Stanton is a screw up. There's no way Sherlock Holmes would become friends with this kid. Eddie Stanton is the son of a very powerful man. He's not the kind of guy Sherlock would bond with. This is a slave. Sherlock was an orphan. This makes total. And my right brain's going, no, you don't know. Yeah. And my left brain's going, no, you can read about it. You'll figure it out. You'll have to do some research. And my right brain's going, well, I can always delete it. and I kept typing it. And ultimately, Abraham, who's this 10-year-old freed slave, becomes Holmes's companion on his adventure and a very key part of the book. And I started reading slave diaries and slave journals and these interviews, and they became a huge part of the American story because at the same time as I was sort of jumping into that, we had this tearing down of statues was going on, and this whole sort of let's erase the bad bits from our history was going on, and Twitter mobs were taking down statues on the basis of a snarky tweet that somebody put, without really knowing the history. And the value that the slave voices put on Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and what that meant to them blew my mind. And I thought, this is so important. And it became a very important part of the book. So I was very glad that kid walked out of the shadows while I was writing.
And you weren't even in the shower.
Yeah.
But this is really important. I mean, as we travel too, you go to these, like Gettysburg. When we were in Gettysburg, it's still stuck.
Weird.
It's still with me about how big that was, and how, when you go places like that,
it makes it real.
There's Joseph. He has the slave dwellings project. And we found out about him when we were in Louisiana at Cane River Creole National Historical Park. And that has two plantations. One is Melrose, one is Oakland Plantation. On the Melrose side, they have the original brick slave dwellings. And when you go in there, and it's, they're the only one of their kind in the state. And you feel everything, and you hear the stories of them having to live underground, and as a nanny is at the bottom of the house, and there's snakes and things. I mean, it's Louisiana. So all of this history is so important. And Joseph goes around, and people sleep in slave dwellings across the country, not as much on the west side, but in the areas where they're there, to understand what it was like. And you see the markings on the walls. You see I really encourage people to go to the places and to read books like with what you're doing, because if we don't keep that story alive, we may repeat it. And we can see that kind of behavior can happen pretty fast.
Yes. And there are some, I mean, what Black family wants their child to go to a school named Robert E. Lee Elementary School, right?
Right.
But to take down a statue of Lee without understanding exactly, this was a guy who, as Sherlock Holmes talks about in the book, he did not declare for Virginia, he did not declare for the South. For the Confederacy. He waited for what Virginia was going to do. He was not a guy who said, well, I'm all for, he owned slaves, yes, but he was not a guy who said, well, I'm going to go fight to keep slavery. He was waiting to see what his state of Virginia was going to do. And if Virginia hadn't seceded, he may well have ended up fighting for the Union.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more in this than just, he was bad, he was good.
Yeah, that's something we learned going to Gettysburg and talking, even the bed and breakfast owners that we stayed at, George's on York in Tawnytown, Maryland.
Oh,
and he, Chris Hillman, he really loves Gettysburg. He's like, you need to go here, 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 here. And, this is the way you take this hike, because you'll see this. And we've done a lot of interviews with artists and residents in Gettysburg, and telling the story is so important. When we were there, we realized, and even it happened in Little Rock too, Little Rock, Arkansas. Remember the Confederate statues, Nancy? It was even just memorials.
Yes.
They said that a lot of times people were going in to fight because that was their state, their land, not necessarily thinking, oh, I'm doing it to be a slave owner, that it was something you were supposed to do for your family, that they were fighting for their families. And So slavery, I mean, we know Washington had slaves, Lincoln had slaves. I mean, pretty much Lincoln did.
Lincoln didn't have slaves.
I thought he did.
He had a black valet
Okay.
in the White House. Nancy, or his wife, Mary Lincoln, her family were Southern slave owners. Yes.
Yeah, in Kentucky, we went to her cabin in Springfield, Kentucky. You can see where they met and their very first cabins, and his brother's house is there. It's a state park right next to a golf course. Who knew? But
well, I'll tell you a quick Wall Street story. So you know how people they use little images of either themselves or people they like or superheroes or stuff on Twitter. And
yeah.
So, and this goes back probably 5 or 6 years before all this stuff started, really started, the statue tearing down. And a guy that I was in touch with had his little image was a Confederate General, Nathan Bedford Forrest. I recognized it just because I read all that stuff. And I reached out to him and I said, do you know, I get why you like Nathan Bedford Forrest as you're a stock guy. And he was an unschooled general who was probably the best general on either side, even better than Stonewall Jackson. He was daring, bold, did nothing by the books, always won, was audacious, the whole bit. But he was a slave trader before the war. He was a totally bad human being. He was responsible for the slaughter of black troops at Fort Pillow during the Civil War, where black troops tried to surrender and they were shot down. And after the war, he became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
Ew.
Wow.
Totally despicable
That's creepy.
character. And I reached out to this guy. I said, you know, why would you use him? And well, you know, he was such a cool, he was so, you know, he did this, he did that. And, you know, and that's kind of the way I want to be as a stock trader. And I said, yeah, but, you know, there's other guys you could emulate. I mean, you know, he's a bad. So the point I'm making is there are guys where they don't deserve statues.
Right.
But there are guys who might have a blemished image. There might be issues about them. Stonewall Jackson, for example, yes, he did have slaves. Yes, he did fight for the South. But he taught his slaves to read. He was Christian. He didn't believe they should not be able to read. He taught them to read, even though it was illegal in the South to teach slaves to read, which is something I'm sure you've learned in your travels. Right. And so I think we've lost that ability to see grades of differentiation when we have this debate. And that's one of the themes of my book, is that you really ought to understand your history before you try to erase it.
I agree. You know, recently we went to Galveston. We've have a story feature, like the literary landmarks, is following in the footsteps of artist Ted DeGrazia. He was one of the most reproduced artists in the world. And he studied under Orozco. He also under Diego Rivera down in Mexico, and he's from Arizona, but he did a painting series on Cabeza de Vaca. And so we knew that there was a landmark plaque of de Vaca in Galveston, and that's where he came in, you know, on his expedition with his, you know, soldiers and his, you know, men, and they ran aground and ended up in the desert and sick and dying. I mean, it's not an easy desert to start walking across, you know. So we decided, let's go there. And then we find out, speaking of literary landmarks, Texas considers him the very first travel writer of Texas, because he wrote notes about what was going on in the desert. So it's pretty cool about that. But we finally found where his plaque was, which was this little thing saying that he was there. Yeah. And everybody else had these huge
Kilroy
things.
Was here.
I was pissed, man. I'm like, dude, these people are going through the desert, over 200 people dying, you know, come on. And he gets this little square without, they didn't even etch his picture in, you know. Anyway, in the center of all these people having all of these big plaques and fancy things is this statue. And it was a beautiful statue. It was well done, because I'm looking at the art and I'm like, well, who's this dude? Well, they took the plaque down, so now we don't know who it is. And so I'm like, that doesn't really help us to understand. And I see that happening. I've got photos of statues that have been removed, one in Santa Fe, and I have the original statue. It was Hidalgo. And they wrote this whole nice thing. Was it Hidalgo? I'm going to get it wrong. Don't quote me on that. But it was like, he was this peaceful guy with the Indians, but apparently not that peaceful. So why can't we just tell the truth on these statues and say, here's the good, here's the bag, and here's the ugly, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
I wish we could do that.
Just replacing plaques. If a plaque is leaning towards honoring somebody that we shouldn't be honoring, then just change the plaque.
Yeah.
And tell the truth so that the history remains and we don't forget the steps that we have evolved from.
Yeah. I'm scared of that.
Pretending it didn't happen.
You know, if you keep going down that route, ultimately you could become the white supremacist's best friend.
Yeah.
Because if you eliminate any memory of this stuff,
right,
people could say, well, it must not have been that bad, right? I mean, what's the problem here?
Yeah.
And the more you know about it, the more you dig deep into it. It was terrible. It was a problem. But there were grades of good and goodness and grades of badness. Grant's statue was removed somewhere, I heard, because he did own a slave at one point, but it was given to him as a gift by his father-in-law on their wedding, I think. And I think Grant held on for a year or two, and then I think he said gave him freedom. But this is a general who literally freed 500,000 slaves in the state of Virginia. And not to mention Mississippi and Vicksburg, everywhere they went, thanks to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was such a profound change to the war effort. What that did, and people don't quite grasp what that did, is the minute a Union soldier appeared on a farm or a plantation, those slaves were freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Wow. Because once that territory became Union territory again, those slaves were freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation. If that proclamation had not been, if Lincoln had not pushed for that proclamation and signed it, when Grant took the state of Virginia back, those slaves would still have been slaves until the 13th Amendment was passed, and then try and get them, out of the hands of the plantation owners. So anyway, it's fascinating, and I'm all in favor of knowing more before you make irrevocable decisions. And one of the things I try to do in the book was bring that voice we talked about, that rational voice of Sherlock Holmes, to this whole discussion.
I love this. I love what you're doing and having this discussion too. I know people are going to email us or tweet us like, how dare you say that about the statues? But really it is about this discussion. And I think what it has brought out, and books like what you've written, we do need to have these discussions and actually take a look at history. If anything, let's look at history, learn from it. Let's not move forward. I mean, look at even the storming of the Capitol. I mean, that's something you wouldn't think could happen in this day and age, but there it is, so it's
so backward.
We have some learning to do, and I appreciate what you're doing with your writing, and I hope you come back and keep us posted on the next book. And we're waiting for that audio book too, because I want to hear the voice. Well, thanks again, everyone. JLawrenceMatthews.com. Give everyone the full name of the book so I don't mess it up.
Oh, you didn't mess it up. I just added Lincoln's name at the last minute to mess everybody up. It's One Must Tell the Bees, Abraham Lincoln and the Final Education of Sherlock Holmes.
Thank you.